I, like many others, have joined the Patty Petra fan club. Because this course would not be where it is without her help and the really valuable exercise of talking about the course and thinking about it and watching it sort of morph and develop as she brought in resources and I learned from the resources. That process was really helpful. So I am so on board with course developers, designers, because it made a world of difference. The Story of Radical Renewal Movements in Church History is a course that looks at specific movements within the larger 2,000-year arc of Christian history. Well, they need to have some sort of context, but to do that, how do you do that? And it's an 8-week course. So I decided that I would choose a very short introductory text, Mr. Gonzalez's Church History, the Essential Guide, 86 pages, that offered an overview of the Christian story as a way to form a backdrop kind of timeline in which we could then layer on a deeper dive into a set of movements, radical renewal movements. So as Patty and I began to meet, I said, I want some sort of, I've been thinking about this idea of a timeline, because how do they interact with the Gonzalez text? This isn't a text that you would write a book review on. It's not making a particular argument, developing a thesis and laying it out. It's really an introductory guide, a set of information that seemed important background context for the dive into the material we were doing in the course. So Patty said, oh yeah, it's timelines. And next time we met, she came back with online timeline programs, and I could begin to play with them. One of the first ones we looked at had this terrific spreadsheet. So it was fairly easy to use, and you could take the spreadsheet away in case, for example, the software went away, or they were going to start charging you $50 a year to use it. You would always have a takeaway. But then there was this second software that instead of doing a horizontal timeline, did a vertical timeline. And it was almost like a 2-column newspaper in which you would see these stories sort of as you scroll down your screen that were helping to inform the timeline. And there was something visually I liked about it, but it also helped me gain new ideas for what the timeline could do. That the timeline wasn't just to mark events, but you could begin to embed more material in that. And so then we landed on some software. Another week, Patty came back with Tiki-Toki. My students like to say this, Tiki-Toki. I think it sounds a little silly myself, but we're using Tiki-Toki. And this was a software online program that had some elegance to it. It was visually appealing. You could move from 2D to 3D. You could embed links. It was really remarkably easy to learn to use. And I know that because I began to play with it, trying to sort out how, what would be the student experience with it. And so I ended up then trying to put my syllabus into this software program to sort of make a visual syllabus. It was my way of learning what I was doing. What's this thing capable of? And so I began to play with things like embedding the course description and the overview and who am I, and check this out, here's a little introductory video on YouTube that you might find interesting, as we think about what the study of history is for. Yeah, how not to be boring. So in playing with the software itself, the program, I began to get better ideas about how this thing could work for students. Yeah, so Justo Gonzalez's book, right, so you move back and forth. We were going to use forums. Who's Justo Gonzalez? I could add a little bio about him. He's a prominent Methodist historian, really significant in developing Latino theology. And I could say something about this in this timeline and provide them an example of how when they began to form a timeline, they could use it to identify key events, movements, figures in the history of the church. And then, as happens, you start playing with it. You could add. Wait for this a little bit because it gets even better. Now let it go a little bit.
Let it go a little bit?
Yeah,
Okay.
a little bit.
Sorry.
Hildegard of Bingen was a mystic nun, wrote music for her convent, and this is a contemporary recording. Don't you like it? So yeah, you can chase it down on YouTube. But in the process of playing with it, it was one thing leads to another, and I began to have an enlarged imagination for how this timeline might function in multiple ways. So in conversation, we developed a kind of scheme in which the first layer of the timeline were the spans that Justo Gonzalez was outlining in his essential guide. Early church, or ancient church, early, middle, medieval, Protestant Reformation, early modernity, whatever they all are. And that could form a set of that could be the backdrop of the timeline. And then the next challenge was to sort out how do we then overlay these movements that we're exploring, which are monasticism and the Protestant Reformation and the Radical Reformation and Pietism. How can we overlay these? And part of the reason I wanted to keep it in the timeline and my imagination kept growing for how the timeline could do that was because I was curating all this material. I didn't have one textbook that would do what I wanted it to do, because this is a relatively unique course in that it's trying to look at church history through the lens of renewal movements, and I didn't have a nice textbook that would do that chapter by chapter. So one of the lovely things about teaching history in an online environment is that there are visuals, right? There's all sorts of images on the web. There are film material that are documentaries, if you will, about particular subjects or figures or movements that makes it a much more potentially visually rich medium than, for example, if I was teaching a theology course, which like interpersonal communication is so word heavy, right? Here I thought, there's got to be a way to use this other material. But how do you assess that they're using it and that they're gaining anything from it, that they're watching it, that they're reading it? And so the timeline then became a way to say, okay, so now we've got this timeline. You've identified a couple of critical things. Now as we are dealing with these movements, give me 8 to 10 people or events that are associated with this movement, and populate the timeline, if you will. And that way I can assess that you're reading the material, that you're engaging in the films. It directs you through that material toward an end. But then I was kind of stumped, because if I was meeting with my face-to-face students, I would very clearly talk about mental timelines, but I would say, I don't actually care if you have memorized the date that Martin Luther posted the 95 Theses on, the door of the Wittenberg Castle. You can look that up, right? If you ever needed that in a Trivial Pursuit game, you could find it in a moment. What I want you to know is that it's 16th century, that it's a really important marker for a movement that we hang stuff on. And so how could we get this to move from just populating it as an activity, as a way of somehow memorizing dates and figures and names, and how then could we move towards a next level of interaction with the material? And that's where that timeline, Patty, that had been the linear, more vertical one with the bigger stories, had stuck in my head, and I thought, we could add a third layer to this, in which, in the introduction of the movement sections, and again, you've got some examples here. This is first week. They have just laid the groundwork, the backdrop, if you will, of their timeline.
Like you can see on the bottom, but that kind of is
yeah, it's
the
running.
various periods.
Yeah, early, middle, high point in the Middle Age, late Middle Age, and etc. This was their first assignment, was to basically lay the backdrop down and to populate it with a key figure and a key event. So the rise of Islam, really important for understanding Christian history, because Islam sends the church to Europe and the West. So I realized that instead of book reviews, again, or quizzes, what I could do is ask them to embed an introduction to the monastic movement and a closing short essay that's what's its significance, what's the takeaway, how do I assess this movement now that we have done a set of readings, there's been a film, we have the advantage of a synchronous class session, so we had some in-person, face-to-face via the technology. And so in a sense, then that added a third layer for me to say, have they gotten it? Do they know why this movement is significant and important? And what's the takeaway for them? And when I got to that point, I think Patty and I were sort of mentally high-fived ourselves, because it felt like, oh, that's where this becomes sort of elegant. We've got multiple layers. I can assess that they're doing the work in the reading in the film, that they're forming a layer, this sort of complex understanding of the timeline. But now I can move to how do they interact and understand these movements and their significance. So everything is embedded in the timeline, other than forums, weekly forums, which have prompts and cues, and a final essay which seeks, these are all people who are embedded in ministry settings, whether they're churches or nonprofits, to say, to analyze their own setting and say, how is my setting shaped by these movements? And what's the movement that could most benefit my content? What should we reclaim out of these earlier renewal movements? So that final essay then really pushes them to do a more comprehensive take of all of this and to lodge their own context in the larger context of the Christian story and begin to claim parts of it. Like we're really shaped by the Protestant Reformation or North American evangelicalism, or we're really, a Wesleyan holiness, pietistic movement. But boy, that monastic piece of discipline and community life and dedication to God could really help us. So I haven't gotten to those essays yet, but that will be at the end. Patty, one other thing, can you put up the band mode?
Oh, on here?
Yeah, on the timeline.
Sure.
Yeah, if we can remember. We're still learning. Although we had no phone calls or emergency texts last week about how to use the timeline. So really, which is quite amazing.
That's good news.
Yeah, but now as a professor, I can see how they are in a different kind of a view. I can see where they're lodging things. We asked them to assign every movement a different color. So what's in the Protestant Reformation, the radical, the pietistic, Pentecostalism, monasticism. So at a glance, I can take, one look like this instead of taking all the time to navigate all the details of the timeline in a different way. And if you, Patty, will you open one of these? These stories, yeah, these more. Okay, here's the other thing I can do. I can just move through the stories. So the next one and the next one. So if you think about the time it spends to grade these, I can do multiple ways of interacting with the material. And there's a sort of conciseness to being able to follow their piece. Well, yeah, really nice here's John Calvin, who he is. Yeah, really nice example of what students are able to do, and how I can also interact in various ways as I'm trying to grade it. So we're experimenting, seeing how it works. Interested to see. I sort of think it's kind of a deep, dark hole that students are gonna, be at midnight on a Friday night, and think, oh, I could add one more thing. Because that was my experience in writing even just the short timeline. All of a sudden, I was back into Jesus music, out of the Jesus movement in the 1960s and 70s, and making Patty listen to stuff that neither of us had listened to, but we could hum. So it was kind of fun. So that's what I'm doing in my church history course, and I'm very intrigued. No research paper, but this way of engaging with the material. And I think history lends itself to this kind of format in ways that would be, I don't have my head yet wrapped around how I would teach my Christian thought class in my version. Patty, anything, what do you want to point to or show?
Well, I think, just because it is, she really hit on the curation thing, because she had so
much.
All of these resources that were rich and wonderful, but how do you, in this asynchronous, your context is everywhere space, bring all that together and give them all some sort of a common experience. And this is, I like the word elegant, this is an elegant way to do that. Now, you can't do that in every case, but it was really fun to really come up to that. And the one thing I want to say is I'm getting, my name's getting spread out here a lot, but you need to know Jason found Tiki-Toki. That's the team nature of how we work. We sort of start something out there, and I said, if any of you have a good timeline tool, well, Jason just starts working. And we had sort of hit a wall with the two we were looking at, and he found Tiki-Toki, and it ended up being the perfect tool. So it's a lot of heads coming together to make that happen.
Thanks.
So,
Maybe time for one question for Valerie. If someone has a burning question about the tool or approach.
That was something they're doing together.
No, they're doing them individually. So imagine it as a resource for themselves that they can keep on. It's free for students, although we ended up buying a teaching package. It gave us a little bit more extended use. It gave us more band options, span options, a category, But anyway, individually. So it also then helps me assess, are they able to identify the right things to populate their timeline? If they're missing Martin Luther and John Calvin and the Protestant Reformation, they're not paying attention, and we need to know that. So that's also part of what it is doing for me.
I think that's also a great way to look at the affordances of tools. Not only are you using them to present something, and I'm sure you cannot say no one has read your syllabus, but also can students use the tool to demonstrate understanding and engagement.
And we're working with ministry students, and so it felt like we were also offering them some software that they could use in other contexts, whether they were doing a Sunday school lesson or a church orientation of some sort, because of the way that you can embed links to films, that you can do visuals, all sorts of media, that this had applicability in other settings, and so it was a nice takeaway for students.
Thank you.
And could I point out one thing, because we talked about copyright, we did encounter, and this is a classic example of, we did encounter some films that we wanted to use that, most of them were available free, but there were two that Valerie had the DVDs for. So, taking the DVD and making that streamable and accessible, we had to contact Vision Video, and they worked with us just seamlessly, really to give us the digital rights to be able to put those on our server and stream them. This is an example of one of those. And also an example of sort of, maybe some students won't get this content as well through video, and so there's an alternative text there. Some of them would rather do it through text, there's another option for them. So there's, this is the main way, but just in thinking through all of those little pieces, that was one of the, in this class, you know, we had to encounter and get over a couple of those obstacles.